Dear viewers, brace yourselves as we unravel a fascinating tale penned by none other than the Queen of Mystery herself, Agatha Christie. Narrated by the exceptional Dr. Rami, this story is brought to you exclusively on the Detective Tales. But before we dive in, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You wouldn't want to miss out on more thrilling adventures. Today, we explore Poirot's Pekingese paradox, the first in a captivating series of short stories, where Agatha Christie ingeniously weaves the classical labors of Hercules into the fabric of Hercule Poirot's modern-day investigations. Originally published in the late 1930s, this series reflects Christie's brilliant fascination with mythology. She seamlessly frames Poirot's sharp intellect against the backdrop of ancient myths, blending clever storytelling with rich cultural symbolism. This literary alchemy wasn't just unique. It elevated the detective fiction genre by infusing it with historical depth and a layer of intellectual intrigue. The story opens with Poirot in his immaculate, modern flat. Everything about it screams precision, from the chromium gleam of its furnishings to the uncompromising design of its chairs. Sitting with Poirot is Dr. Burton, a plump, untidy man radiating warmth and wisdom. While Poirot is the epitome of neatness, with his egg-shaped head, signature bow tie, and a mustache that could outshine any rival, Dr. Burton is the polar opposite, a man who leaves a trail of tobacco ash wherever he goes. The two engage in a witty and thought-provoking conversation about names, appearances, and the burden of expectations. As always, Poirot's quick wit and logical mind shine. Yet Dr. Burton's musings bring an unexpected charm and humor to the scene. What follows is a delightful exchange where Poirot contemplates retirement and an unusual new hobby, cultivating vegetable marrows. Yes, vegetable marrows. But as you'd expect, Poirot's approach is anything but ordinary. He dreams of perfecting the flavor of these tasteless vegetables, turning them into something exquisite with a bouquet to rival fine wine. Dr. Burton, naturally, reacts with amused horror, his disdain for this mundane pursuit contrasting sharply with his romantic vision of leisure, cozying up in a library with a glass of port and a good book. Yet beneath this light-hearted banter lies something deeper. Poirot, the man of intellect and precision, is suddenly struck by doubt, a fleeting realization that perhaps he has missed out on the richness of life's quieter pleasures, like immersing oneself in the classics. It's a rare moment of vulnerability, adding layers to his character that make him even more relatable. But as always, Poirot's unwavering commitment to solving the perfect case wins out. Retirement might be on the horizon, but for Poirot, the lure of a compelling mystery is too irresistible to ignore. So, dear viewers, get ready to join Poirot as he embarks on another intellectually charged adventure, blending mythology, wit, and the timeless charm that only Agatha Christie can deliver. Don't forget to comment below. What would your dream retirement look like? And stay tuned for more tales where the mundane meets the extraordinary. As Dr. Burton bid farewell, a wry smile curved his lips, his white hair glowing faintly in the soft light of the study. He turned to Poirot, delivering a parting remark with a twinkle of mischief in his eyes. "Yours aren't the labors of Hercules, my friend," he quipped, pausing just long enough to let the words sink in. "Yours are the labors of love." And with that, the amiable scholar, pipe in hand, vanished into the night, leaving behind not only a trail of pipe smoke, but also an idea that would ignite a fire in Poirot's ever-restless mind. For a moment, Poirot stood frozen, his brow furrowed in thought. Burton's words lingered in the air like an unfinished symphony. The labors of Hercules. What could he have meant? Slowly, as if teased by the muses themselves, an idea began to take form. It was a notion so audacious, so perfectly Herculean in its essence, that Poirot allowed himself a rare chuckle. Back in his impeccably ordered room, his sanctuary of symmetry and style, Poirot considered the notion further. To embark on his own labors of Hercules was not merely a whim, it would be a statement. Yet his labors would not resemble those of the mythical hero, a man whose exploits were steeped in savagery and brute force. No, Poirot had no admiration for that ancient icon. The tales of the Greek demigod painted him as a brawny relic, a man of violence and chaos, driven by impulses Poirot could only describe as barbaric. Poirot, in stark contrast, was a man of intellect and precision, the epitome of order in a disorderly world. He prided himself on his refined demeanor, his sharp wit, and his peerless analytical mind. If he were to undertake his own labors, they would be distinctly modern, civilized, and utterly unique. The very next day, Poirot set about his research with characteristic zeal. He dove into the world of classical mythology, not with the reckless enthusiasm of a layman, but with the meticulous approach of a scholar. Miss Lemon, ever efficient, procured an impressive array of texts for her employer: leather-bound tomes, annotated manuscripts, and crisp notes that filled an entire table. Poirot studied each detail of Hercules' legendary feats: the slaying of the Nemean lion, the cleansing of the Augean stables, the capture of the Golden Hind. What he uncovered left him both amused and horrified. The great Hercules, worshipped as a paragon of heroism, was little more than a glorified brute. His so-called heroics reeked of barbarism, his victories marred by unnecessary bloodshed. To Poirot, this was no hero. Hercules was a thug, a relic of a chaotic past, glorified by a world that had yet to discover the virtues of order and reason. Poirot glanced around his room, the sharp lines and perfect balance of his surroundings offering a stark contrast to the disarray of those ancient tales. There, in the polished glass of a nearby cabinet, he caught his reflection. A small but impeccably dressed figure, his egg-shaped head gleaming under the soft light, and his mustache standing as a monument to personal perfection. Here was a modern Hercules, he thought, a hero for an age that valued intellect over brawn, logic over force. And so, the idea crystallized in his mind. He would accept precisely 12 cases before his retirement. No more, no less. Each case would be a reflection, a modern interpretation of the mythical labors of Hercules. But his challenges would be different, refined. There would be no damsels in distress, no wild beasts to wrestle, no senseless violence to glorify. Instead, Poirot's labors would be puzzles of the highest order. Intellectual challenges that demanded not strength but brilliance, cases that would leave an indelible mark on the art of detection. The first labor, of course, would be the Nemean lion. Poirot smiled to himself, a gesture of quiet satisfaction. His lion would not be a literal beast. No growling creatures from the zoo would suffice. Instead, the lion would be symbolic, a figure of great renown, someone who dominated their field like a king of the jungle. Perhaps an artist of unparalleled genius, a politician of global influence, or even royalty. Yes, royalty would be most fitting. A monarch ensnared in intrigue would be the perfect opening act for his Herculean series of cases. Poirot allowed the thought to settle, savoring the elegance of it. He would not actively seek out these cases. They would come to him, as all great puzzles did. He would wait patiently, like a chess master awaiting the first move of an opponent, confident that the game would unfold as it must. As the storm of inspiration raged in his mind, Poirot straightened his tie, adjusted his cufflinks, and cast one final glance at his reflection. The labors of Hercules may have been born of myth and violence, but Poirot's labors would be of logic, of artistry, of unparalleled finesse. The game was afoot, and the modern Hercules was ready to begin. The next morning, Poirot entered his office with a sense of renewed purpose. He had spent the night pondering the grand idea of his 12 modern labors, cases that would challenge his intellect and cement his legacy as the world's foremost detective. He imagined himself unraveling puzzles of global importance, dismantling webs of intrigue, and revealing truths hidden in the deepest shadows of human cunning. The world, after all, was a stage, and Hercule Poirot was ready for his next act. As he stepped into his office, his polished shoes clicking softly against the tiled floor, Poirot adjusted his perfectly aligned tie and gave a polite nod to Miss Lehman. She was already at her desk, her usual air of brisk efficiency filling the room. Her fingers danced across the keys of her typewriter with the precision of a concert pianist. To Poirot, she was the epitome of modern order and reliability. "Anything of interest this morning, Miss Lemon?" Poirot inquired, his voice brimming with anticipation. Surely, today would bring forth the first of his labors, a case so captivating, so intellectually demanding, that it would echo through the annals of history. Miss Lemon, without pausing in her typing, gestured to a neatly arranged pile of correspondence on the corner of her desk. At the very top lay a single envelope, its crisp edges and elegant script suggesting a sender of some refinement. "This one might intrigue you, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her tone neutral but confident, as though certain it would meet his high standards. Poirot picked up the letter, his fingers brushing against the fine paper as he carefully opened it. His eyes scanned the words, his sharp gaze dissecting every detail. He paused, his brows knitting together in confusion. He reread the letter, as though his brilliant mind had momentarily faltered. Surely he had misunderstood. The letter was a request, a plea, really, from a man named Philip Richardson. The nature of the plea: to locate his wife's missing Pekingese dog. Poirot froze mid-step, his usual grace momentarily abandoned. "A Pekingese dog?" he muttered aloud, his voice tinged with disbelief. He turned the letter over, as if expecting some hidden code or secondary message to emerge. But no, the letter was precisely what it seemed, a request to find a missing pet. Poirot's face contorted in a rare display of utter despair. A dog? A dog? After envisioning a case worthy of his genius, a tangled conspiracy, a duel of wits with a criminal mastermind, he was presented with this? A missing Pekingese? It was as though the universe had decided to play a cruel joke on him. He shot a glance at Miss Lemon, who remained utterly unfazed, her fingers still flying over the typewriter keys. Her calm demeanor only added to his frustration. "Miss Lemon," he said, his voice heavy with exasperation, This is the case you have deemed worthy of my attention." Miss Lemon finally looked up, her expression cool and unbothered. "It seemed unusual," she said, her tone practical. "And you did say you wanted something intriguing." Poirot sighed, a sound that conveyed the weight of 1,000 disappointments. "Intriguing," he echoed. "A Pekingese dog, Miss Lemon, a Pekingese. This is how the great Hercule Poirot begins his Herculean labors? With a canine caper?" Miss Lemon, unfazed by his melodrama, returned to her typing. Poirot, however, continued to pace, the letter still clutched in his hand. The absurdity of the situation gnawed at him. How had it come to this? After dreaming of grand challenges, he was reduced to playing the role of a pet detective. But as Poirot's pacing slowed, a different thought began to take root. His sharp mind, ever restless, began to tick. Was it possible, just possible, that this case held more than met the eye. After all, he reminded himself, even the grandest puzzles often began with the smallest, most innocuous details. He stopped pacing and turned the letter over once more, studying it with renewed focus. Perhaps, he murmured to himself, even a trivial matter can conceal great intrigue. The surface may appear ordinary, but beneath it, who knows what mysteries might lie. He straightened his posture, the hint of a smile playing at the corners of his lips. Yes, this was how it must begin, not with grandeur, but with subtlety. A missing dog might not be a roaring lion, but perhaps it was a key to something larger. And if anyone could unravel the truth behind this peculiar plea, it was Hercule Poirot. Poirot folded the letter carefully and placed it back on Miss Lemon's desk. "Very well," he announced with dramatic flair. "I shall take the case." Miss Lemon looked up briefly, a faint flicker of amusement in her usually stoic expression. "Very good, Monsieur Poirot," she replied before returning to her typing. As Poirot settled into his chair, his mind was already racing with possibilities. A missing Pekingese was hardly the Herculean challenge he had envisioned, but the day was young, and the world was full of surprises. And so, with his characteristic mix of determination and flair, Hercule Poirot embarked on the first of his modern labors. It was the morning after Hercule Poirot had received personal thanks from none other than Buckingham Palace itself. The letter of gratitude now rested prominently on his desk, a testament to his brilliance and the unmatched precision of his little gray cells. Feeling immensely pleased with himself, Poirot savored his morning chocolate, the rich aroma wafting through his immaculate apartment. The world outside, with all its noise and inefficiencies, felt distant and irrelevant. Poirot, as always, was surrounded by order. His furniture perfectly aligned, his papers neatly stacked, and even his breakfast tray a study in symmetry. Yet, despite this haven of precision, the sharp wit of Hercule Poirot longed for an outlet. Words, witty, biting, and devastatingly accurate, swirled on his tongue, ready to lash out at the chaos of humanity. But alas, Miss Lemon's impeccable typing drowned out all sound, her fingers producing a rhythmic clatter as they flew over the keys. Poirot sighed dramatically. There was no point in delivering a scathing remark to someone who wouldn't hear it. Miss Lemon's focus on her work was legendary, and her efficiency bordered on supernatural. With a grunt of frustration, Poirot turned his attention to the pile of correspondence on his desk. The topmost letter, as Miss Lemon had described earlier, was plain, curt, and thoroughly unrefined. Poirot picked it up gingerly, as though the lack of elegance in its presentation might sully his perfectly manicured hands. Opening it, he scanned the contents quickly. It was a demand, pure and simple, from a certain Sir Joseph Hoggan. The matter? The alleged kidnapping of his wife's Pekingese dog. Poirot's mustache twitched, a subtle but unmistakable sign of annoyance. "A dog," he muttered under his breath, his lips curling in disdain. The image of the creature, a small bulging-eyed ball of fluff, pampered and spoiled beyond reason, flashed through his mind. Rich women adored such dogs, and their devotion often defied logic. To Poirot, the affair seemed beneath his notice, a trifle unworthy of his talents. A meeting with Sir Joseph Hoggan. Sir Joseph Hoggan was, as he so proudly declared, a plain man. Hercule Poirot, ever the master of subtlety, made a small non-committal gesture with his hand. A gesture that could be interpreted as polite agreement, subtle critique, or simply a distraction to avoid rolling his eyes. Plain, indeed, Poirot mused as he took in the man seated across from him. Sir Joseph was a thick-set figure, with piggish eyes that gleamed with self-importance, a bulbous nose that seemed perpetually red, and jowls that wobbled slightly with every word he uttered. there was a certain crudeness to him, a lack of refinement that grated against Poirot's innate appreciation for elegance and order. And yet there was something oddly familiar about him. A memory tugged at the edges of Poirot's mind. Something about Sir Joseph's demeanor, his bullish presence, struck a chord. But like a name on the tip of the tongue, the memory remained just out of reach. "No frills about me," Sir Joseph continued, his voice a booming baritone that seemed designed to fill every corner of the room. "I don't waste time with airs and graces. Most people would let this sort of thing go, write it off as a bad debt, but not me. That's not Joseph Hoggin's way." Poirot offered a courteous nod, murmuring, "I congratulate you." The unexpected remark caught Sir Joseph off guard. His small, sharp eyes narrowed suspiciously, as though Poirot had spoken a veiled insult. "That's not to say I throw my money around," he added quickly, his tone defensive. "What I want I pay for, but I pay the market price, not a penny more." Poirot shrugged with the elegance of a man who had no patience for quibbles about money. "You realize, of course, that my fees are high," he said, his tone deliberately neutral. "Yes, yes," Sir Joseph replied, leaning back with a smug grin that revealed slightly yellowed teeth. "But this is a small matter, and I don't expect it'll take long." Poirot's mustache twitched ever so slightly, an almost imperceptible movement that hinted at his irritation. "I do not bargain, monsieur," he said, his voice as crisp as the morning air. "I am an expert. For the services of an expert, you must pay the appropriate price." Sir Joseph chuckled, a sound that was more bark than laugh. "That's why I called you. I've made inquiries. They all tell me the same thing. You're the best man for the job." Poirot inclined his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "You are exceedingly fortunate, monsieur. I am, if I may say so, at the apex of my career. Very shortly, I intend to retire, to the countryside, where I shall cultivate my garden. I have an ambition to improve the flavor of vegetable marrows." "Marrows?" Sir Joseph blinked, the word catching him off guard. "Magnificent vegetables," Poirot said, his eyes lighting up momentarily. "They are plentiful, versatile, and of admirable size. And yet they lack flavor. This I intend to remedy." He waved a hand dismissively. "But that is beside the point." Sir Joseph, looking thoroughly bewildered by this detour into horticulture, shifted uneasily in his chair. "So, why take this case, then?" he asked gruffly. Poirot straightened in his seat, his expression sharpening with a mix of pride and resolve. "Before I retire, I have set myself a task, a final challenge. I shall accept only 12 cases, no more, no less. Each will be a modern reflection of the labors of Hercules, the great hero of antiquity. Yours, monsieur, is the first of these labors." Sir Joseph frowned, his piggy eyes narrowing. "You say you picked my case because it's important." "Non," Poirot replied, his tone precise and unyielding, "because it is strikingly unimportant." "Unimportant?" Sir Joseph sputtered, his jowls quivering with indignation. "Precisely." Poirot leaned forward, his sharp gaze fixing on the man with the intensity of a falcon spotting prey. "I have investigated murders, thefts, and crimes of great magnitude, cases that have shaken nations and confounded the greatest minds. But this, monsieur, is the first time I have been asked to solve the kidnapping of a Pekingese dog." Sir Joseph's expression darkened. He let out a grunt, his lips curling in disdain. "I'd have thought you'd be pestered with cases like this all the time. Women and their damn pets." "Certainly," Poirot replied smoothly, with a faint twinkle in his eye. "But this is the first time the husband has approached me directly." At this, Sir Joseph's piggy eyes gleamed with a newfound appreciation. He gave a short, sharp nod, as though acknowledging Poirot's point. "I see now why they said you were a shrewd one. Very shrewd." Poirot inclined his head modestly. "If you would be so kind, monsieur, tell me the facts. The dog disappeared when?" Sir Joseph's demeanor shifted slightly. His bluster softened, replaced by a hint of genuine concern. "Yesterday evening," he said. "It was around 6 o'clock. My wife had taken the dog, Shangri-La she calls it, for a walk in the park. She let it off its leash for just a moment, and when she turned around, the dog was gone." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his mind already piecing together possibilities. "Gone, you say? And was there any sign of struggle? A sound? A figure in the shadows?" "Nothing," Sir Joseph replied, his voice gruff. "She swears she saw no one. But the way she's carrying on, you'd think someone had stolen her crown jewels." Poirot smiled faintly. "Sometimes, monsieur, the small things are of the greatest value to those who cherish them. And sometimes—" He paused, his expression turning thoughtful. "They are of greater value than they appear." The room fell silent for a moment, save for the faint ticking of a clock on the mantel. Poirot leaned back in his chair, his sharp gaze never leaving Sir Joseph's face. "Tell me, monsieur, has anyone made a demand? A ransom note, perhaps?" Sir Joseph's jowls quivered as he shook his head. "Not yet, but I wouldn't put it past these scoundrels to try. That's why I came to you. I want the dog found before it gets to that." Poirot nodded slowly, his mind already working through the intricacies of the case. A missing dog might seem trivial, but the circumstances, the sudden disappearance, the lack of witnesses, the potential for a ransom, hinted at something more. "This," Poirot murmured to himself, "is not as simple as it seems. A week ago. And your wife is, by now, quite frantic, I presume." Sir Joseph's face darkened. "You don't understand. The dog has already been returned." Poirot's eyebrows shot up. "Returned?" "Exactly." Poirot leaned back in his chair, his sharp mind already whirring. "This, monsieur, is becoming more intriguing by the minute." Hercule Poirot was seated in his elegant chair, savoring his morning chocolate, when his valet arrived with a fresh batch of correspondence. Poirot's sharp eyes caught a peculiar envelope as he skimmed through the letters. His lips curled in disdain as he noted the curt and inelegant demand scrawled within. It was about a dog, a pampered little creature belonging to a wealthy woman, kidnapped and ransomed for £200. Nothing about this case seemed remotely Herculean. But then there was a detail, a small, curious detail. Miss Lemon, his meticulously efficient secretary, had been right. Something unusual stood out. His curiosity piqued, Poirot instructed her to arrange a meeting with Sir Joseph Hogan, the client. At Sir Joseph's office, the man wasted no time. "I'm a plain man, Mr. Poirot," he began, his face flushed and his small, piggish eyes narrowing. Hercule Poirot remained non-committal, his sharp mind already dissecting the character before him. Sir Joseph's loud bluster and bulbous features reminded Poirot of something, or someone, from long ago. "I don't throw my money around," Sir Joseph continued, "but I pay for results. That's why I called you in. This business, it's a racket. I refuse to be swindled." Poirot raised a thoughtful eyebrow. "A racket, you say? Please, recount the facts." Sir Joseph launched into the tale. "A week ago, our blasted dog, Shantung, was taken while out in Kensington Gardens with my wife's companion. The next day, a demand arrived, £200 in unmarked notes, or they'd harm the dog. Naturally, my wife, Millie, paid it without telling me. And the dog was returned." Poirot's eyes twinkled. "Harmless? Perhaps. But Hercule Poirot never underestimated anyone. Hercule Poirot found himself standing in the somber, cabbage-scented gloom of the Balaclava private hotel. As he surveyed his surroundings, the dreariness of the atmosphere struck him immediately. The entry hall was unwelcoming. A battered mahogany table with a wilted chrysanthemum plant seemed to underscore the melancholia of the space. Above the table, a large, dust-covered rack displayed a sparse collection of letters. Poirot's sharp eyes lingered on it thoughtfully. Curious, he pushed open the first door on his right, stepping cautiously into what appeared to be a lounge. The room was furnished with tired-looking armchairs draped in faded cretonne fabric. 4 occupants turned as one to glare at him. 3 elderly ladies bristling with disapproval, and 1 fierce-looking old gentleman who fixed Poirot with an expression of outright hostility. Poirot, somewhat abashed by their collective animosity, muttered an apology and quickly withdrew. Venturing further down the passage, he discovered a staircase and a corridor leading to the dining room. Halfway along, he noticed a door marked "Office." Poirot knocked politely, but no answer came. Pushing the door open, he peered inside. The room contained a large desk, cluttered with untidy stacks of paper, but was otherwise empty. Disappointed, Poirot closed the door and moved toward the dining room. Inside, a disheveled young girl in a stained apron shuffled listlessly between tables, setting out cutlery with all the enthusiasm of someone condemned to eternal monotony. Poirot approached her with his trademark politeness. "Excuse me," he said, bowing slightly. "Might I see the manageress?" The girl barely glanced up, her expression one of pure apathy. "I don't know where she is," she muttered. Poirot pressed gently. "Perhaps you could find out for me?" The girl heaved a sigh so heavy it seemed to carry the weight of all her worldly woes. "I suppose I could try," she said, shuffling off with the air of a martyr. Poirot thanked her and returned to the hall, once again examining the letter rack. Moments later, a rustling sound and an overpowering waft of Devon Violet's perfume announced the arrival of Mrs. Hart, the manageress. She was a plump woman with an air of officiousness, her sharp gaze sizing Poirot up with practiced efficiency. "Terribly sorry I wasn't in my office," she gushed, her tone dripping with false graciousness. "Are you inquiring about rooms?" "Not precisely," Poirot replied, his tone measured. "I was hoping to find out if a friend of mine has been staying here recently, a Captain Curtis." Mrs. Hart frowned, her brow furrowing. "Captain Curtis, you say?" "The name rings a bell, but I can't quite place it." She trailed off, glancing at Poirot expectantly. Poirot waited, offering no further details, allowing her to search her memory. After a moment, she shook her head regretfully. "I'm afraid I don't recall a Captain Curtis staying here. At least, not recently, but the name feels familiar." "Perhaps," Poirot suggested delicately, "letters or parcels might have arrived here for someone under that name, even if they were not an actual guest?" Mrs. Hart nodded thoughtfully. "That does happen on occasion. We always keep such correspondence for a while. You see, it often means the person is planning to arrive shortly. But of course, if letters or parcels remain unclaimed for a long time, we return them to the post." Poirot inclined his head, his expression inscrutable. "How very prudent," he murmured. Hercule Poirot nodded thoughtfully, the wheels of his sharp mind turning. "I comprehend," he said softly, then added, "It is like this. You see, I had written a letter to my friend here." Mrs. Hart's face lit up in sudden understanding. "Ah, that explains it. I must have noticed the name on an envelope. We do get so many ex-army gentlemen staying here, or just passing through. Let me think." She turned to peer at the letter rack. Poirot, ever observant, interjected calmly, It is not there now. I assume it has already been returned to the postman." Mrs. Hart nodded apologetically. "I am so sorry. Nothing important, I hope." Poirot dismissed her concern with a polite wave. No, no, it was of no consequence. As he moved toward the door, Mrs. Hart, still wreathed in her overpowering cloud of violets, bustled after him. "If your friend should come, it is most unlikely. I must have made a mistake," Poirot replied, sidestepping her. Undeterred, she continued eagerly, "Our terms are very moderate. Coffee after dinner is included. Would you like to see one or two of our bed-sitting rooms?" With difficulty, Poirot extricated himself from her clutches and moved on. Later, in the lavishly decorated and oppressively overheated drawing room of Mrs. Samuelson, Poirot found himself surrounded by gilded furniture and oppressive central heating that seemed designed to suffocate rather than comfort. Mrs. Samuelson herself was tall, with peroxide-dyed hair and an air of overconfidence. Her dog, Nanki Poo, was an arrogant little creature with bulging eyes, scrutinizing Poirot disdainfully. Miss Keble, Mrs. Samuelson's companion, was the polar opposite. Thin, nervous, and breathless. She, like Miss Carnaby before her, had been blamed for the disappearance of the precious dog. Miss Keble launched into a frantic explanation. "It all happened in a second, Mr. Poirot. Right outside Harrod's. A nurse stopped me to ask the time." Poirot interrupted smoothly. "A nurse? A hospital nurse?" Miss Keble blushed furiously, stammering, "No, no, a children's nurse. Such a sweet baby, too. Lovely rosy cheeks." Mrs. Samuelson cut in, her tone as sharp as her disdain for Miss Keble's blunder. And while Miss Keble was fussing over a child that had nothing to do with her, the audacious thief cut Nanki Poo's lead and made off with him. Miss Keble looked ready to dissolve into tears. "It all happened so fast. I turned around, and the darling boy was gone. All I had left was the dangling lead in my hand. Would you like to see it, Mr. Poirot?" she offered. Poirot declined hastily. His collection of mysteries did not extend to cut dog leads. The rest of the story unfolded predictably. A ransom letter followed, demanding $300, with threats of violence to Nanki Poo's delicate ears and tail. The money was to be sent to a Commander Blackley at the Harrington Hotel in Kensington. Mrs. Samuelson confessed, "After Nanki Poo was safely returned, I went to the hotel myself, Mr. Poirot. After all, £300 is £300. Her dramatic pause hinted at the disaster to come. And the first thing I noticed in the hotel's letter rack was my own letter with the money. While waiting for the proprietor, I slipped it into my bag. Unfortunately—" Poirot finished her sentence knowingly. "Unfortunately, when you opened it, the envelope contained only blank sheets of paper." Mrs. Samuelson turned to him in astonishment. "How did you know?" Poirot shrugged, his explanation simple. "It is obvious, madame. The thief would recover the money before returning the dog. Then he would replace the notes with blank paper and return the envelope to the rack to avoid suspicion in case its absence was noticed. No such person as Commander Blackley ever stayed there." Mrs. Samuelson's face darkened with frustration. "And, of course, my husband was furious about the whole thing. Absolutely livid." Poirot ventured cautiously. "You did not consult him before sending the money?" Mrs. Samuelson responded decisively, "Certainly not. I wouldn't have dared. Men are so peculiar when it comes to money. Jacob would have insisted on going to the police, and I simply couldn't risk that. My poor darling Nanki Poo. Anything might have happened to him. Naturally, I had to tell my husband afterward, because I needed to explain why I was overdrawn at the bank." Hercule Poirot sat, his meticulous gaze fixed on Miss Amy Carnaby, as he cradled Augustus, the intelligent little Pekingese on his knee. The once concealed truth now lay bare, and yet Poirot's tone was measured, almost gentle. Miss Carnaby, her face pale but resolute, confessed in a voice both dignified and trembling, "Yes, it is true. I have done this terrible thing. I am a thief, and now I am caught." Her invalid sister Emily wept softly on the sofa, adding a layer of sorrow to the already tense atmosphere. Poirot, with his signature quiet authority, asked, "Have you nothing to say in your defense?" For a moment, Amy Carnaby hesitated, her hands trembling before she spoke, her words imbued with both desperation and defiance. "I don't regret it," she began, her voice gaining strength as she continued. "You see, Mr. Poirot, I've been so terribly afraid of the future, of growing older, of becoming unwanted, of being cast aside like so many other poor, untrained companions. There's no room for women like me, no money saved, no influential friends to help us. All I could see ahead was a life of cold, hunger, and despair, perhaps ending in a bleak institution, if I was lucky. I couldn't let that happen to Emily or to myself." She paused, tears brimming in her eyes but refusing to fall. "And then there was Augustus," she said, looking down at the dog fondly. "People can't tell one Pekingese from another, and Augustus, with his clever little ways, gave me the idea. These wealthy women with their precious dogs, they love them so blindly, they'd pay anything to get them back. And so we planned. We were careful, organized. Augustus was brilliant. He'd slip away and return home as trained, while I pretended the theft had just happened. It was all so simple, really." Poirot leaned back, his face a mixture of admiration and reproach. "Simple and effective. 16 times, you say? Remarkable indeed. Your organizational skills are, as your father said, quite remarkable." Emily interjected softly, "Amy always planned everything. Bazaars, socials. She has a gift for it." Poirot nodded, his voice now tinged with a faint smile. "And as a criminal, mademoiselle, you are quite in the first rank." But Amy, hearing the word criminal, flinched as though struck. "A criminal," she murmured, her voice cracking. "Oh dear, I suppose I am. But it never felt like that. It never felt wrong. Not when it was for Emily, for our survival." Her words hung in the air, heavy with both guilt and justification, leaving Poirot to contemplate the moral shades of justice, the desperation of fear, and the thin line between ingenuity and crime. Amy Carnaby was sitting in her modest flat, her hands trembling as she stared down at the check. £200, a sum that not only symbolized her second chance at life, but also a quiet acknowledgment from the world's most brilliant detective. Her eyes brimmed with tears, a mix of relief, gratitude, and disbelief. "Emily, Emily, come quickly," she called out to her frail sister in the adjoining room. Emily shuffled in, her brow furrowed with concern. "What is it, Amy?" Emily asked, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. Amy held up the check, her voice breaking with emotion. "It's from him, Emily, Hercule Poirot. He's returned the money Sir Joseph was so determined to take back, and he even wrote a note. Listen to this. Dear Miss Carnaby, allow me to enclose a contribution to your very deserving fund before it is finally wound up. Yours, very truly, Hercule Poirot." Emily gasped, covering her mouth. "Amy, you've been so incredibly lucky. Just think. If things had gone differently, you might be sitting in Wormwood Scrubs right now. Or is it Holloway for women?" Amy nodded solemnly, her gaze dropping to Augustus, the little Pekingese dog lounging on the rug. His beady eyes stared back at her, full of unspoken mischief. "Yes," she murmured. It could have been a prison cell for me. But it's all over now, isn't it, Augustus? No more walks to the park with Mother or her friends, and no more little scissors hidden in my pocket. The Pekingese barked once, wagging his tail as if he understood every word. Amy reached down to scratch behind his ears, her voice softening. "Dear Augustus, you're so clever. One can teach you anything, can't they?" A wistful silence settled in the room. For a moment, Amy's thoughts drifted back to those audacious days, the thrill of the plan, the precision with which each step was executed. She had to admit there had been a certain intoxicating satisfaction in outwitting those wealthy, selfish women who hardly seemed to miss the money they paid to rescue their beloved pets. But now, all that seemed like a distant dream, or rather, a dangerous nightmare from which she had narrowly escaped. Meanwhile, Hercule Poirot was wrapping up the case in his signature style. Sir Joseph, seated in his grand study, had initially scoffed at the idea of letting a swindler go unpunished, but Poirot, ever the master of persuasion, had offered a compromise: the money in exchange for discretion. As Sir Joseph clutched the check that Poirot handed him, a peculiar chill crept over him, a reminder of something unspoken yet undeniable. "You're a damned clever little devil," Sir Joseph muttered as Poirot left. The words felt oddly inadequate to describe the small, enigmatic man who had just waltzed out of his life, leaving behind an unsettling sense of vigilance. Poirot's final remark still echoed in his ears, a pointed warning to tread carefully. From now on, Sir Joseph knew he would think twice before engaging in shady dealings, especially those involving a certain platinum blonde he had been quite taken with. Lady Haughton, however, remained blissfully unaware of the storm that had passed. "Funny," she remarked one evening over her tonic. "This doesn't taste bitter anymore. I wonder why." "Chemist must have mixed it differently," Sir Joseph replied gruffly, avoiding her gaze. Deep down, he knew it was more than just a difference in the tonic. As for Poirot, he returned to his apartment with a sense of satisfaction. The case may not have been a grand murder mystery, but it had been a test of wits nonetheless. Amy Carnaby, with her clever schemes and audacious spirit, had proven to be a fascinating opponent. A modern-day Robin Hood, as Poirot had once called her. But even Robin Hood had to lay down his bow eventually. Poirot poured himself a glass of wine and allowed himself a rare smile. Another case closed. Another balance restored. Amy Carnaby, meanwhile, stared at the check one last time before tucking it safely away. Life would go on now, quieter, simpler, and infinitely more honest. Yet, as she looked down at Augustus, a small smile tugged at her lips. "You know," she murmured, "it seems almost a pity. You're so clever, my little lion. One could teach you anything." Augustus barked again, and Emily chuckled softly from her chair. "Yes, but perhaps it's time Augustus learned to enjoy retirement, Amy. We all deserve a bit of peace now, don't we?" Amy nodded. Yes, peace sounded wonderful. And for the first time in a long while she truly believed it was within reach.